start with one question, lighthearted one. Commissioner, when you first learned that some in the crypto industry have coined you Crypto Mom, what was your reaction?
Well, before I start, even before I say that, I have to give my little disclaimer, which is that my views represent my own views and not necessarily those of the Securities and Exchange Commission or my fellow commissioners. Well, so I got, on Mother's Day, I got a card, a handmade card from someone who said, "Happy Mother's Day, Crypto Mom." And it was one of my favorite moments as a commissioner. You know, I thought that the person took the time to figure out how to send me a letter, first of all, snail mail, which is great. And, you know, took the time to draw the card. And I thought, you know, if I had a child, the child would probably be like that, because I always made cards for my parents when I was a kid. So anyway, it's been an honor to be adopted by a group of people who I think are really thinking in such exciting and interesting ways, and trying to think about ways that they can change the world. And thinking about problems that we've had for a long time, and thinking about them with fresh eyes. I mean, some of the thinking they're doing is thinking about monetary policy in new ways, thinking about ways to solve problems, the fact that people aren't included in the financial system, thinking about ways that people can be included. So that's what's exciting to me, is that there's a community of people out there who are taking a fresh look at things.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think that, you know, in our work, we're meeting constantly different collaborators that help us push the borders even further. And with that, I'd love to see if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, you guys should ask questions, because otherwise we'll talk about things that are not interesting to you.
So it doesn't
have to be about crypto. It can be about anything you want to ask.
Have a question? Yeah.
There's been a debate about whether, you know, the initial start of Bitcoin was as a transaction system for payments. There's been a debate about whether it's an asset or it's just a mechanism for payment. What are your thoughts on that? Because obviously you believe that they are assets, otherwise you wouldn't be in a conference about
I'll
these
just add,
assets.
if you can see your name and possibly which company.
My name is Vipin Bharathan. I'm the founder of DLT.NYC.
Well, I do think that I mean, again, there's a wide range of digital assets. That's what we call them at the SEC, because I think it sounds more respectable or something, I don't know, or cryptocurrencies. And so Bitcoin is one, and I think people, if you ask people, you'll get that wide range of views. You know, on the one hand, you will get people who say, yeah, mainly I thought of it as a transaction mechanism. You know, the speeds haven't been that fast, so a lot of people maybe don't think that that's where it's going to go, but it could still go there. But I think store of value is a really important function for some of these cryptocurrencies. And I do think that we'll see, as technology changes, we'll see them becoming much more the money of the internet, which is how I sort of think about them. I mean, I think it's a way to unleash the power of the internet in a way that hasn't been possible before now. But, you know, I'm not a technologist, and so other people probably have a better sense of where they think the space is going to go.
Hi, Commissioner Peirce. I haven't seen you since I think you were in the Senate. David Wheel. What do you do to get the United States to be quicker in turning around new technologies and views? There's an amazing amount of sort of institutional sclerosis and inertia, whether it's because Chairman White leaves the SEC and we wait for Chairman Clayton to be installed, and the institution seems to be, you know, somewhat paralyzed when we look at DTCC, which is dominated by bulge bracket firms. And I've had the personal experience of trying to get them to accept crypto, or actually tokens as securities, and they sort of just go silent on you. the exchanges. I mean, ultimately, this is making the United States significantly less competitive with the rest of the world, largely not just because we don't seem to be able to move, quickly and decisively in embracing these kinds of transitional technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about that, and I think there are a couple different causes for it. When I came to the SEC, one of the things that I wanted to do is see if I could change the agency's culture in terms of innovation, because when I had been there before, I had seen that we're just so slow to deal with new technology or even new products within our traditional space. But it's hard for an agency, one that's been around for as long as the SEC has, and one that there have been some advantages to our conservatism, right? Because the industry, the capital markets in the US are extremely strong. They're the place where everyone in the world wants to come to raise money or to invest. And so we've really benefited, I think, from a strong regulatory structure. But there has to be a way that you can balance that need to have, to be careful with the need to allow more innovation to happen. So I think there are a couple things we can do. We can bring more people in from the outside to learn from them, but it's really hard. Even to hire someone to come into the SEC to work on digital asset issues. I think trading and markets looked out, which is one of our divisions, looked outside of the SEC and didn't find anyone. So ended up, because people don't really want to come work at a regulator. And so ended up, I think, hiring from within, which is fine. We have lots of good people at the agency, but I think it's really healthy to have people coming and going so that people are bringing from the outside some of the knowledge of the current technologies, and people are going out of the SEC with knowledge of how our rules work and of how to comply with those rules. I think that's a very healthy dynamic. But frankly, the SEC sometimes needs a push from Congress. We saw that with the Jobs Act, which required the SEC to do some things to make capital formation for smaller companies work more seamlessly. The SEC has authority to do some of these things, and I think in the digital asset space, we have authority that we could use to make it possible for more innovation to happen. But we tend not to use it because, again, if something goes wrong, they're going to come and blame us. And they're going to say, why didn't you stop it from happening? So I think we also need, both as me as a regulator, but also you as citizens, need to have your expectations balanced, and you need to tell other people their expectations should be balanced. If you want a government that's more forward-thinking on innovation, that means that if something goes wrong, you can't go running back to the government and say, hey, you didn't protect me from myself. So there needs to be that balance to realize that we're all responsible adults. We can all make our own decisions. You should not throw your money into one of these crypto projects without asking questions. If you do, then you should assume that money is going to be gone. We all have seen in this space that there's a lot of bad stuff happening because it's the hot place to be now. And so we need to send that message too, is, okay, we can have the balance, but everyone has to play her own role in this process. And the role of someone investing in this space is ask a lot of questions before you throw your money in. And maybe if we get that right, then we'll stop being so paternalistic. I'm not sure that'll happen because that's just how regulators tend to be, but I think we need to be a little bit less paternalistic.
If I may, that resonates also with your first principle you discussed at the committee, which was balancing the need to regulate, yet to also allow opportunity. So the SEC should be concerned with fraud, but also with allowing opportunity for different investors. If they want to throw their money at something, there should be some framework around in which they can do this relatively cautiously. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that principle of opportunities are part of investor protection, ensuring that people have opportunities. It's not really that radical of an idea, but at the SEC, it does sound radical. And my response is, people would all be safer. We could all just tell them, put your money in nice FDIC-insured bank accounts, and then we can all be like Europe, because Europeans have so much more of their money in the banking system. The dynamism in this country is in large part because we've had very well-functioning capital markets that enable money to flow to people who have good ideas and put those good ideas to work. And so we need to allow investors at all levels to participate in that market and to build their futures and to draw money from that market when they have good ideas. And one of the things, too, that we always think of at the SEC is we tend to look at each product and say, oh, that looks really dangerous, instead of saying, most people have a portfolio. And so they're going to have some mutual funds. They might own some stocks directly, and maybe they want to have a little bit, they're going to have some bonds, and maybe they want to have a little bit of crypto to round that out. Again, I'm not advocating any kind of portfolio, but I've had a lot of people tell me they want that kind of asset to round out their portfolios, yet we don't allow them to get access to it through our markets. And my question is, why not, as long as whoever is offering it in our markets is disclosing what they need to disclose about the product they're offering and allowing the investor then to make a decision.
Commissioner, would you say that the agency is moving away from the broken windows approach, especially in terms of its enforcement activities, and maybe for the benefit of everyone, because not everybody may know what broken windows is? Could you just kindly sort of explain it to the audience?
So the broken windows approach was an enforcement approach that the agency embraced several years ago. And it was basically to say, it's modeled on the policing notion that if you allow little things to be unfixed in neighborhoods, the neighborhood starts to look junky and people start to do worse crimes. So the idea is if you clean up the small crimes, it'll create a better environment. There won't be the bigger crimes. And so in the securities space, the idea was if we go after little compliance infractions, every little compliance infraction we find, people will be properly scared and they won't do the big things. The problem is that the area that we regulate and the way we regulate it is so detailed, and so even well-intentioned people can easily fall afoul of the rules. I view my job as a regulator to set forth clear rules, and then we have a compliance function, which is, so if investment advisors and broker-dealers are registered with us, we go in and we look at them and we see whether they're complying with our rules, and we tell them if they're not. And usually there's something that's not compliant, and so we send them a letter and we say, hey, this is how what you need to fix, and the company fixes it, and we can all move on. Now, if there's a company that says, yeah, well, you saw the problem and go pound sand, we're not going to fix it, then we might bring an enforcement action. And so my view is there's always plenty of stuff that's going on that's really bad, and we need to conserve our enforcement resources, which are precious and limited, and go after the really bad stuff, and then use our compliance function to help the people who are not trying to violate the rules but maybe doing something wrong, to help them come into compliance. So, in the crypto space, I think that's an interesting. It's interesting to see, to think about how we need to apply our enforcement resources. Obviously, there's a lot of fraud that we go after, and we should go after. We have to go after, but we also have brought cases for people who have simply done an offering that's a securities offering in the crypto space as an ICO and haven't registered it. So we have brought those kinds of cases too. And the question is, where along the spectrum do you fall, and how much of our attention should we be spending at each place on the spectrum?
Commissioner, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think banks, financial institutions, and perhaps other players could facilitate some of the investment and financial inclusion and other opportunities that you were speaking to, and particularly how well equipped you think they are to play that role and maybe some of the challenges they face?
Well, so I should start by saying that, banks are not in my direct purview to the extent they're providing traditional banking services. And I actually think the capital markets can be a better route for financial inclusion than the banks, although I think banks are trying a lot of interesting things. I mean, with technology, it's much easier to reach people that previously weren't being reached. So we saw and are still seeing a decline in the number of small banks, community banks, and a consolidation of banking. And so what that often means is that you'll see banks in small communities shutting down. You'll see the branches shutting down. And so because now everything can be done online, there's a lot more ability to serve people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to be served. But you lose that direct connection that a local banker might have with someone in the community and know, you know what, this person is really hardworking and is definitely a responsible person and will pay back the loan. So you lose that personal community banking touch. But I think you can replace that with properly functioning capital markets, and that's something that we're trying to do at the SEC, which is think through ways that we can, enable micro offerings, for example, where people in a local community could put money into a project that they see that has promise to it. But right now, so much of the capital is just on the coasts. It's here in New York, it's in Boston, it's of course in Silicon Valley, and so a lot of the middle of the country is not gaining access. And I think that's an area too where we'll see digital assets becoming really important, because I think there'll be an ability, one of the things I value about this space is that it allows people all across the world to join together in projects and to find people with good ideas and to, I think, fund those ideas ultimately. So I think there's some promise in this space as well, that maybe traditional banks have more trouble meeting that promise.
Good morning, Commissioner Peirce. I'm Tina Baker-Taylor from Global Digital Finance. So my question is looking at, you mentioned Europe before, and the US's role kind of in the global regulator stage. And working across with different regulators, there's often challenges in communication and different vernacular being used, and harmonizing policy is always going to be a challenge. One of the things that I've seen work well, to some degree, is the sandbox environment in other jurisdictions. So with the launch of GFIN, the Global Financial Innovation Network, what would it take for the SEC to get more involved in cross-border sandbox projects to be able to potentially help innovators move across border with a little bit more clarity from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, the cross-border issue is, I think it's a big challenge in a lot of the different spaces that we regulate. We do have quite a bit of interaction with our fellow regulators across a wide range of issues, including issues in this space. And I think you're right to say we can learn from what other regulators are doing. I mean, we have seen some other regulators using sandboxes, and we've seen a lot of innovation go to those places because people feel comfortable that they can work with the regulators. So that's something that has been instructive to me. I mean, I have some concerns about sandboxing because I think putting innovators in a sandbox with regulators watching over their shoulders feels a little bit stifling to me in terms of what innovators will be able to do if they always have to worry about the regulator sitting in the room. But I do think it has value, and I think it's something that we can explore more. I think we need, though, in the US to come up with a cross-regulator sandbox before we're sort of ready to work across international borders. I think it would make sense for us to think about something like that, SEC, CFTC, and then the banking regulators. And so, I'm hopeful that something like that could happen, although it's sometimes, it's really hard to do even domestic coordination. I do a lot of work with the CFTC, and the CFTC has been really great on technology issues. So, I think it's possible for us to work on developing something like that, the two agencies, and then maybe it can spread beyond that.
You just touched a big pain point for a lot of our clients is they're not sure anymore who they need to please, to what extent, in which jurisdiction. So having a cross-regulatory sandbox, is something that, would absolutely help the industry.
Hi, good morning. My name is Harsh Singh. I worked for T0, which is a security token offering. I know SEC has approved a lot of ATS and dark pool to trade those STOs, but hasn't approved any broker-dealer to trade those digital assets. What would be the reason, SEC is holding back on these approvals?
Well, that's a question I also have. And I think that the question, that typically the issues I hear are issues related to custody and showing that you actually, showing where the assets are and that you're the only one who has exclusive control. And then I think the other issue is SIPC, which is, there's an insurance, so you've got FDIC on the banking side, you have SIPC on the security side. The purpose of SIPC is a bit different than the purpose of FDIC insurance, and it's capped, and you get there are caps on the amount of cash and securities that you can get back if your broker-dealer fails. And it's unclear at this point where digital assets fit and how they would be treated if there were a problem at a broker-dealer. So if I were telling someone, what to spend time thinking about, I would say think about custody, think about auditing, what an auditor would do looking at digital assets, and think about how this should be treated under SIPC. But, again, I think the whole process where you've got all these people waiting with their applications and there's not really a clear sense of what's going on is very frustrating. And it's frustrating for me too, because when I ask, everyone's always pointing fingers at everyone else. But keep the conversation going about these key issues. If you have suggestions about how we can think about some of these issues, come talk to me directly, come talk to our staff, point me to things if you think there are things that are worth my reading or podcasts that I should listen to where people are discussing these issues. I need to understand them better, so please do that, because I think if I have better answers on these, I can do a better job pushing from within the agency to get some movement.
Commissioner Peirce, thank you for being here. I'm Amy Kim. I'm with the Chamber of Digital Commerce. As we all know, the classification and jurisdiction over tokens and whether they're a security or not a security is one that continues to challenge, I think, the industry. At the Senate Banking Committee hearing a couple of days ago, you had mentioned the possibility of a safe harbor. And I'm wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit more what you're thinking around that option.
Sure. So I think this is a concept that I'm trying to develop, and again, would really welcome people's input on how I should be thinking about it. But I think that we at the agency have authority to develop sort of some kind of a no-action position, which will basically say we won't bring an enforcement action for you not registering your offering as a securities offering, for not registering your token as a security, essentially. If it's a utility token that you're in the process of getting a network up and running for. And so, the question is, someone said to me the other day, the ICO boom is kind of done. So that's not really where the problem is anymore. The problem is that people who have gotten actually funding from accredited investors have projects that they want to launch. Then they're ready for their networks to go live, but they're scared for their networks to go live because they're worried that then we're going to say, now that these tokens are going out to retail investors, you've got a securities problem. So I think a safe harbor could both, I still want to have a way for ICOs to happen, so I think a safe harbor could both address the ability, say you can do an ICO, but you've got to provide certain disclosures saying, how many tokens they're going to be that are going to be issued, how many tokens you have, the promoter have, what your plans are for building the network, and then you've got a 2-year or whatever time frame run period where you can get your network up and running. And I think that same safe harbor could be valuable for a project that had originally gotten its funding from accredited investors and now was ready to launch. And so what we'll say at the end of 2 years, if you're not looking like a network that's operational, you're going to have to register those tokens as securities. But if you're up and running and operational, then you're not in the securities laws at all. And for me, the value of that is that it allows these networks to actually become networks. What I worry about now is that even if you do your offering, say you do your offering under Reg A, as a couple projects have done, how do you actually move from having the thing be treated as a security where it has to trade in the way that securities have to trade, to being a thing that's used in a network for the purposes it was intended in the network? I don't know how you get from point A to point B, absent some kind of a period where you have relief so that the token can move among to the people who actually want to use the network. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. As you can see, it's a very unformed idea still. So if anyone has brilliant ideas about what we might do to make this workable, I think it would be very helpful for me. And I think there may be appetite among my colleagues at the SEC to do something limited like that, because it would, the fact that you have a time limit, I think would put some discipline on projects. And say, you can't just dither around for 10 years and say, oh yeah, we're building a network. You actually have to, at the end, you've got to show something, you've got to shut down, or you've got to register them as securities.
Thank you for your time. What are your thoughts on firms doing STOs, like using a regulated transfer agent?
I mean, I think that to the extent we can use the existing players in our securities market, involving a transfer agent, certainly adds some credibility to things. Now, what the pushback, I guess, I've gotten is that it sort of defeats the point of the blockchain. You've got everything on the blockchain, and then you've got a transfer agent who's maintaining a separate ledger of all the securities. So it's a bit odd, but I think right now it's kind of the expectation still. I don't know if you had anything more specific in mind.
Is there any way you could talk about the comfort level with the ETF?
My comfort level?
Yeah, just like the agency and where you guys are, if it's coming, timeline.
Well, so
Timeline.
Exact dates.
So I tell people be patient with everything that the SEC does because we're slow. So the example I like to use is that ETFs, regular plain old ETFs, started 25 years ago. And just now, this year, we're getting around to doing a final rule that allows ETFs to operate without having to come in and get special permission every time they open a new ETF. So that could be instructive.
The example I usually like to use when I'm being asked this question, the tick size pilot program while working at Goldman Sachs took about 2 years working with regulators on a very simple, defined, scoped pilot program to implement in the systems. So yes, for this type of initiatives, it's going to take probably longer.
Hi, my name is Eliseo from TaxMap. Just a quick question, because America has a number of agencies, just basically about enforcement as well as guidance and so on. I was just wondering about the relationship with the SEC and NASA, the North American Securities Association, and their operational kind of enforcement arm as well. I'm just wondering, like, what's the overreach? Because they have, I guess, different variables. Canada is included in it, I think, as well. So I'm just wondering, like, with the globalized, decentralized digital asset, who's kind of in charge?
Maybe the other NASA should be in charge. So I think we and the state regulators work closely on a lot of issues, and there are many areas where we've preempted them. But I think in this space, the state authorities that have been most active it's been the money transfer folks. So you see a lot of state activity on that level because everyone's having to register as money transmitters. But to the extent there's a fraud and it's a crypto fraud, a state might get involved in enforcing the securities laws there. We work closely, as you said, the Canadians are part of NASA, and we work closely with them on lots of issues. But in terms of the rules in this area, to the extent they're securities, I really think they're going to be at the federal level and not at the state level. Because I think by nature of the asset, it's much harder to keep it limited. You can do limited state offerings, and those are then going to be governed by the state. But I think it's just more likely in this space that you're going to have a national offering. But it's, they're looking at the space like everyone else, and they're worried about it like everyone else, as we all should be, right? We have seen a lot of fraud in the area.
Hi, my name's Rachel. I'm with Hedera Hashgraph, and I was wondering, if coins are being bought and sold for use in a marketplace as they're needed, can you offer more clarity, or is more clarity going to be coming about secondary markets and this type of activity?
Well, so that sort of ties into, I should have brought this up when I was talking about the safe harbor. I think a piece of that safe harbor has to be that there can be trading on secondary markets, because if you're paying a developer in the using the token, that developer needs to be able to trade that in for fiat or for for Bitcoin or whatever. So I think you'd have to allow secondary markets, and then to the extent at the end of that period the token was a functioning token, then it can trade in secondary markets. Those aren't security markets. And that would provide, I think, an issue we face now is that a lot of trading platforms they're paralyzed because they don't know how to figure out whether something is going to be treated as a security or not. And so they don't know whether they can trade it on their platforms. And the guidance that we put out, as everyone knows, is not the easiest thing to decipher. And so I think we're asking these trading platforms to take on a fair amount of legal risk when they trade a new token. And so I'd like to provide more clarity. I appreciate, we have a staff who really is interested in these issues and who's been working very hard on them. And I appreciate their desire by putting out the guidance that they put out to help people think through the problems. And we don't put out lists of things that are securities and aren't securities. That's just not, historically, that's not what we've done, and that's certainly not what we've done in this space. But I think given the lack of clarity and the people who are really trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, I think we need to do something to give them some more parameters within which they can figure out what to do. And that's why I actually came into this thinking that we didn't need to do anything specific for digital assets. And I've come to the point where I think we do need a safe harbor because I think there's some unique complicating factors of digital assets that makes it much more difficult to figure out whether or not something is a security. And I think the framework that we've set up now makes it virtually impossible for anyone to be able to argue, I'm not a security, because you can never get to the point where you're functional. And so it just seems to be a completely unfair way to apply the securities laws. And so I'm hoping we can come up with a better approach.
You mentioned on Tuesday, Commissioner, in a principles approach possibly, having overarching guidelines versus very specific laws that, you know, can remain constant while realities change. Is that also something that...
Yeah, and I think that's the value of the securities laws, is that they have been malleable enough. In the US, we don't, some other jurisdictions have very definite definitions of what a security is. In the US, we've been much more open-ended and principles-based, and the thinking is, you know, there are a million ways that you can go about asking people for money so that you can build something, and then giving people a piece of that. Well, if you're doing that, that's a security, right? I mean, if you're, it's the same thing as a share. If you're building something and you say, when this project is successful, your share of it will be worth more. So I think that framework has worked relatively well, although I even have some concerns that there have been the Howey test, as everyone now knows, I mean, as it's been applied over the years, I think it's been applied probably too broadly in some other contexts as well. I think the digital asset conversation has really forced us to focus more on it and see, maybe there's some other things that we've classified as securities that might be better classified as something else. So principles are great, but I think principles need to have clear enough lines that people don't feel like they're on a tightrope and they're going to fall off into the land of violating our securities laws.
Hi, John Garfield with Bond One. Over the summer, the SEC has been requesting comments for changes to the securities laws, such as accredited investor status or the securities exemptions. I was wondering what the Commission's view is on some of these proposed changes.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We put out a concept release, which is, so typically when we do a rulemaking, what we do is we put out a proposal, we get comments, and then we put out a final rule. But sometimes when we're thinking a little bit more broadly and we really want people's input to help us shape a proposal, we'll put out a concept release. And that's what we did this summer with respect to thinking through what we can do to open up the private markets to people who might not now have access to them, and think about ways that we can make our public markets work better. But I encourage people to, I think the comment deadline might already be over, but you can take a look at our website and weigh in on things like the accredited investor definition. Think about if there are changes that need to be made to Reg A or crowdfunding. Weigh in on that. We take comment letters even after the deadline closes. Sooner is obviously better, but it's important to have as many views as possible so that we can think about what we might want to do to change securities laws. One of the things that our chairman has been really forward-thinking on is, he came in and he said, look, the private markets are doing really well, but retail investors can't participate in that, and that's a problem. And the public markets are not looking as attractive. So why aren't the public markets in the U.S. as attractive as they once were? And so we're thinking through different ways to make companies want to participate in our public markets, which we think is better because it allows more across-the-board participation by investors, from small investors to large investors, but also thinking about ways that retail investors might be able to get a piece of the action going on in the private markets.
Hi, John Salmon at Hogan Lovells. I thought it was really interesting, utility tokens, and from someone based in London, we've been looking at this for a long time from a European perspective, and as you know, the European regulators have for quite a while been focused on the fact that there is such a thing as a utility token in the non-regulated space, but there's been different approaches, I would say. I think one of the challenges is how do you figure out what the intention of the investor is, or the potential token holder? And I think getting to grips with that is actually, I think, one of the fundamental problems, because clearly people have been issuing a utility token when it's really an investment, and people have been trying to issue a utility token and worrying about it becoming an investment. And as you say, moving from that kind of investment space into that network space is actually a real challenge. How do you see the balance of all these things working and trying to figure out, because FINMA's guidance says it's not got to be investment and there's got to be utility at the point of issuance of the token, for instance. So I really like the idea of the 2 years, but I think getting underneath the intention, it's very difficult for a token issuer to figure out what the intention of the potential token holder is ultimately.
Well, and that's why I think that the focus on what investors might have thought is it's a bit misguided to focus on that. And I even worry that sometimes when we look at an offering, we'll take statements by the issuer that say, your token is going to be really useful sometime and therefore really valuable. And we've said, it's an investment. Yeah. Well, no, actually, it's them saying, our project is going to be really cool. Yeah. And we expect a lot of people are going to want to use it. And so if you're in on the ground floor, the tokens you buy are going to be worth a lot. Well, I mean, okay. So I like to make the comparison with Beanie Babies, right? Beanie Babies are not what most of us would think of as securities. But I just read a book about the Beanie Baby craze that was about, 20 years ago, I guess. Yeah. And it was an eye-opening book. But the company was actually able to create a buzz around different Beanie Babies. And it meant that those Beanie Babies went up in value like crazy, and then they would retire them. I mean, they were very strategic in thinking about how they announced them and how they, hinted at when retirement might happen, and so it drove the prices up. I don't know. To me, I think we should have brought I'm not actually going to say that, but but I'm just saying that, if we apply the reasoning that we're using in this space, it might surprise some of us what else could suddenly be considered a security. So I think instead of, they're difficult questions, right? I think we need to look at, if you're saying, give me your money and we're going to build a project and you're getting a piece of that money, you're getting a piece of the value of it, that looks like an investment to me. That looks like a security to me. It looks like something that we should regulate as a security. If you're saying, come buy the tokens, you're going to be able to use them in this network, and we can show to you, we have a plan for bringing this network live, and we can show you that after a certain amount of time it's up and running, then I think it doesn't make sense to classify it as a security even at the beginning. But, they're hard questions. I mean, I think what a lot of people have found to be the best approach is just limit your offering at the beginning. And I'm not giving legal advice. Just limit your offering at the beginning to accredited investors, and then you can, when you're further along, you can move into the wider world. But even that, I think people are struggling with.
Yeah, no, you're right. And what we've seen many of our clients doing globally is doing a bifurcation of the token. So you might have two tokens. You might have one token that, as you say, is accredited investors only, and it is an investment, and then another one that's a utility token. But then how do you commingle the two, and how do they work together is very difficult. And I think I think having some clarity, and as you say, the cross-border issue is very difficult for clients to try and get their heads around different treatments.
Yeah, it makes for lots of good law review articles by law students. I think people have a lot of really, and look, they're thinking about these issues in probably more sophisticated ways than we regulators are. So I really hope that a lot of people will help us think them through, because I think we really do need input in trying to draw the right lines.
So as it stands, you've given us a lot of great ideas about ways that things can be adjusted to make this system work better. What do you think are the most promising avenues for the digital asset community to pursue at this point in time? Where are the dead ends or the roadblocks that really are probably not going to be changed for a while? And where are the opportunities for some flexibility for some advancement?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, I think one thing that you can all keep doing is helping us regulators learn more, right? I think there's a lot of value to, I mean, we saw with the Libra debate that in some ways it brought a lot more attention to digital assets, and I think that's been helpful, and people have gotten more interested in learning about them. So, you know, whether it's on the legislative side or on the regulatory side, I mean, that's not a really very satisfying answer because you actually want to see things happen. But I think that's probably the most useful way to make things happen and to show us that there are projects that actually have a use. And I think, I was talking with someone about this yesterday, and you know, they said, look, at the beginning of the most industries, they're kind of inward focused, and then it's only over time that they start to become outward focused, and they get the interfaces that allow the retail public to interact with them. But I think because we're not, you know, we live in an impatient age, and we're not seeing that outward focus yet. A lot of people have just written this space off as completely useless. And so I think a lot of the battle still is in making the case for the space. And I think then we'll be able to see progress. Again, not a very satisfying answer. And I invite you to work with me on thinking through the safe harbor idea, because I think if I can put out a concrete idea, it's obviously more likely to come to fruition.
Hello, Commissioner Peirce. John Normile from Horizon Globex. Touching on your comment a moment ago about Beanie Babies, you perhaps could make the argument that rather than securities, they're commodities. And that brings me to my question of how the SEC is working with the CFTC on the question of digital assets.
Well, the CFTC, as I said, has been, I think, really much ahead of us in this area. I think they've gotten, obviously, the futures markets are up and running, but they also have had a real intentional, and for quite a long time now, desire to foster innovation in their space. And I agree the lines between I'll give the CFTC Beanie Babies. I might want to take something from their jurisdiction in exchange, but I mean, I think I'm working with Commissioner Quintens fairly closely on a separate project, but we do talk about crypto, and we do talk about where the lines should be. And so on something like, you know, if you really have a utility token that's up and running, maybe it's a commodity, maybe it's not even that, I don't know. But it certainly would be more appropriate in their space than it would be in ours. And so I think I'll continue to work with him to try to figure out where those spaces would be. One thing I'd like to see at some point would be a joint SEC, CFTC roundtable thinking about these issues, because I think it would be a great place to hash out where some of those lines might be drawn. But I think we still have work to do. And we can learn from them, too, on how they're seeing their markets develop.
Well, one more question.
I think we just have one more question over here, and then I think we're good.
Thank you very much for sharing your views. I wanted to ask just also on this federal-to-federal coordination on areas other than classification for things like enforcement strategies or some topics where there could be overlapping jurisdiction like anti-money laundering. What are your thoughts, what are your perspectives on the current state of affairs with your agency counterparts in other agencies, as well as what you would hope it should be or could be?
Well, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is the federal financial regulators, they have a working group on these issues, and I think there are a number of other cross-agency working groups. I'm not personally participating in those, so I don't have as much to add on what the actual nature of the work is. I've done some work at the international level on these issues, and again, it's pretty interesting to see the different reactions on the international level, from banking regulators versus securities regulators, for example, because obviously central banks are thinking about the big picture. Is one of these coins going to make it harder for us to implement monetary policy? And we securities regulators are thinking, this could be a really interesting way to for projects to raise capital, and we're thinking about it much more from the micro level, and I think they're thinking more from the macro level. So I suspect some of those same things go on when you've got the federal regulators talking to each other. But as I say, I haven't been as involved in the cross agency, aside from working with the CFTC, I haven't been as involved.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank Commissioner Peirce for coming here for DACOM.
Thank you all. Thanks so much.